Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm really flattered. Thank you AATCC for the award as well. I'd also like to thank Phil Brown, who's been just an absolute pivotal person in my studies, and I wouldn't be here but for him. Same thing with my wife, who's supported my entrepreneurial habits, so thank you very much. So very quickly, I am also currently the Greenville Health System Technology Transfer Manager, so if any of our 15,000 employees come up with a new medical device, I help patent it, develop it internally, and then license it out to other companies. So you could say that I've gone from a student to an entrepreneur, and now I'm helping many more entrepreneurs with their own projects as well. So if you have any questions for me after the talk or around, please come up and ask. So before I get into the talk, really quickly, let's talk about additive drug delivering devices. What the point of that is in the name is that we're not trying to make new medical devices, we're trying to improve existing ones. So I'm not trying to go up against Stryker or Johnson & Johnson, I'm trying to add new functionality to their existing devices. So in the process of developing this, the NSF I-Corps program has been very helpful. If any of you have NSF funding, then you're eligible for this I-Corps program, which is essentially a 6-month boot camp for, do you have a technology that can be commercialized, and do you think you want to do that? I've also competed in the Southeast BioPlan competition. That was fantastic for finding the right mentors and for helping develop that business plan. And I've received funding from SC Launch, which is in South Carolina, a state-funded VC angel group. So that's very wonderful for finding those early dollars, which are so precious and so hard to come by. They're also looked at as a first in for financing, which is, again, invaluable for an early stage company. So let's talk about the opportunity. Surgical site infections. Everyone's heard of them, maybe, maybe not. So surgical site infections are as defined as any time within up to 30 days after a surgery. If you get an infection, the hospital is liable for treating that infection. And they also get a black mark in their record. So they report back to the government, who can, if they get enough of these black marks, start pulling funding for their Medicare and Medicaid. So hospitals are very much incentivized to reduce the number of infections. The problem that we face right now in the current industry is that there are basically two products that can help with these by doing a localized elution of an antimicrobial drug. Johnson & Johnson has a suture, Vicryl Plus, and Gore, as in Gore-Tex, that same company, has a dual mesh plus for hernia meshes. Those are the only real two products that are currently available on the market, and they both only elute for 2 weeks. So if our standard that we're looking for is at least 30 days, or up to a year if the implantable stays in for longer than that, then you've got 2 weeks of liability on your hands. And no one seems to think that this is a problem. So the original problem that we tried to solve actually was very specific. It came to us from an OBGYN by the name of Scott Sullivan down in the Medical University of South Carolina, and he saw a lot of chorioamnionitis. And so what that is if you have a suture in the cervix called a cervical cerclage installed during the beginning of the 3rd term of a pregnancy to help bolster the strength of a cervix to take the growing weight of a fetus. That suture works great physically. The problem with it is that bacteria can still migrate from the vagina through the cervix, into the uterus, and then infect the chorion and amniotic sacs, hence chorioamnionitis. So what that told us is that we have to have a fiber that delivers an antimicrobial for at least 90 days. And long story short, I made that happen. We had tremendous in vitro data that showed that we had an elution profile that was very consistent, and we were able to stay above the minimum inhibitory concentrations of most bacteria for that drug, which was triclosan. Looking a little bit broader at what the surgical site infection problem is from a financial standpoint, it's a $5 billion problem that should go away. There's no upside to that whatsoever. Happens in about 2 to 3% of all surgeries, no matter what type of surgery it is. Averages about $14,000 per incidence. So everyone wants to reduce their infection rate. What are they currently doing right now? Hospitals are revamping everything they can do to help make the operation more sterilized, but that doesn't help the patient once they leave. And even though they're at home for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, the hospital's still liable for whatever happens to the patient at home. So they're changing their cleanliness standards, and hospitals love this because they don't have to pay for anything. They maybe have to do some retraining, but there's no new line items. And if there's one thing I learned about working in a hospital, surgeons hate new things, and hospital accountants hate new line items. So we have to work with existing products and just change the way that they're being used. The other thing you can do is you could administer a localized antibiotic via syringe, or you can start to go on oral antibiotics. Problem with the oral route is that now you're raising your entire body above that minimum inhibitory concentration to inhibit that bacterial growth. But if it's only really going to occur in that one area, in that surgical site, you're using way more drug than you actually need to. You only should have a fraction of that. So an example of where this could be first used, of course we want to look at the biggest market first. Colorectal surgeries are huge. I mentioned about $5 billion problem in the US, 1.5 billion of which is just colorectal surgeries. They happen about 13.5% of cases, which is much higher than 2 to 3%. And that's mainly because surgeons are fantastic. They're not messing up. It's just a dirty area. This happens a lot. So if we can in any way reduce the number of infections, we would see that change here first. We could reduce our number of our end values so we could get statistically relevant results. Because if there's one thing that everyone knows in the antimicrobial group, it's very, very difficult to prove a negative, okay? Because you can always show that because of this, something happened. It's almost impossible to say because of this something didn't happen. Okay, so some of the advantages in integrating drug delivering devices are, first and foremost, it's a market differentiator. I mentioned 2 companies that currently have drug-eluting devices. There's sutures and hernia meshes. So it certainly adds tremendous value in that. It provides a competitive advantage. It reduces the costs and risks and costs to hospitals and surgeons. In localizing the delivery, we also reduce the total amount of drug that we're releasing because we're not trying to dose the entire body, and because we reduce the amount of drug used, we reduce the complications. One other huge thing that's been spooling around for the last 10 years in healthcare is patient compliance. Can you get the patient to take all of their pills even if they're feeling good? The answer is you can't really. So instead, what we're doing is incorporating the drug directly into the suture. So unless you rip your sutures out, in which case you have more problems, then you will be covered. So how have we protected this? We've patented it. It's still pending. We also looked at the closest technology to what we're currently offering, and we went ahead and got a non-exclusive license to that, which with an option to get an exclusive license. And so normally I skip over this slide very quickly because not very many people in the business realm get the technical side of it. This time I'm going to skip it because you would all get it in the room very quickly and I would be out of a job. So it's based upon 2 things. Number one, we've got a very specific bicomponent geometry comprised of, first, the original polymer that was used in the device that we're trying to improve. So if that's polypropylene, polyethylene terephthalate, that's fine. We don't need to change that. We then add polylactic acid and put it in reservoirs inside the fiber. And we do that in a very particular way I can't talk about. But it does help with the geometry itself helps with the continuous rate of elution that we see of the drug. So over time, you don't see typical Fickian diffusion profiles. Is it moving on its own? Is that just me? Okay, so looking to the future, we're looking to get $55,000. We're trying to raise it from SC Launch, that original state-run group of angels. Other angels not associated with South Carolina, Brookhaven Medical, or other types of companies that buy up early stage stuff. So what we're going to do with that is work on getting more in vivo, so data to focus on how safe and efficacious this device is. A rat model will work just fine. We also want to get a little bit more in vitro data to help justify and optimize the fiber itself. So just very quickly, this is probably more on the business side, more than you guys need to know, but everything is going to be used towards the production of it, the in vivo study of the actual material, and then the IP license. There's nothing that I'm taking home personally as a paycheck. There's nothing that we're building into it as far as overhead. In their commercialization plan, we're going to co-develop external products with like a J&J to try and offer them a suite of devices that are just the same as the ones they're currently producing, except that they have the ability to elute drugs, as well as producing our own internal devices. So ones that don't necessarily adhere to current standards, but maybe exceed them. And then our exit strategy, as you always have to know, you have to have an exit strategy, is to be acquired by a large medical device, offering them that, like I said earlier, that suite of similar devices that have now improved functionality. So all that is a lot to say that I firmly believe in the technology. I know that this is going to save lives. I think that the business plan is very straightforward and easy to swallow for a lot of people. Now, with that said, we're actually no longer pursuing this. So it's kind of a big, tough pill, especially for me to swallow, because there's a lot of things that go into a business, and you have to have everyone just perfect, or else it kind of crumbles. And so for what happened with us is we ran out of that funding. We couldn't find in vitro funding for the in vivo study. And so what I've learned from that are these two big things here. So you can engineer solutions to problems not requested by the market, but it doesn't do you any good. You know, you can make a wonderful widget, but if someone's not going to buy it, you don't have a business. So in my case, it was identified by a surgeon who desperately wants to use it, but the medical device companies say, we have something good going for us, and we don't really want to be in those markets for whatever reason. So we didn't have support from them. So that was a huge blow to us. Hospitals too are saying we don't necessarily want to hear more antimicrobial in this particular realm in the way that we were utilizing it, because the CDC in certain cases like counties say we do not want to see antimicrobial solutions. We want to see different solutions. Also, I licensed the IP a bit too early. When is too early? So in 2007, 2008, 2009, when I was working on this, or began working on it, the paradigm for when an investor would be interested was maybe even in its inception. And then some of these, they'd also take in vitro data. They'd say, great, I'm going to put money into it. I'm going to put $500,000. I'm going to put $2 million into it. But then the crash of 2008 happened, ripples through the investment community, and now they're not looking for such early stage, such risky technology. So once I licensed it, I was no longer able to develop it under the umbrella of Clemson University and the Medical University of South Carolina, the two institutions that own the technology. So all of a sudden now I'm paying the same rates as Johnson & Johnson or Stryker to come in and try and do these medical device studies. So those are very tall orders to fill. So that hasn't stopped me at all from being interested in technologies and from startups. In fact, I'm doing more startups daily than I ever thought I would be because of my current position in the Greenville health system. I'm also very enthusiastic about the technology. If any of you are interested in pursuing it or incorporating it, please talk to me. I'd be happy to talk you through it. How am I doing for time? Okay. Anyway, so in the process of finding whether or not you have a technology that is a good technology to commercialize, first we try to find a square hole and we make that square peg to it, right? You want everything to fit perfectly. But that's really hard to do from an inventor standpoint, because you don't say, okay, I need to invent something that fits these parameters, and I need to learn all the knowledge around how to build each of those parts of that technology. Usually you take the technology and you say, okay, this is really neat stuff, can I commercialize it? And so when you take it from that standpoint, when you take your original research and try and commercialize it, you often find that the market doesn't perfectly fit your technology, and so you end up chipping away at things. So some of these shavings that you chip off are quality of the engineering that you do. Maybe you give up some of the IP protection, and of course the hammer that you use to drive that in is really time and money, or which are basically the same thing. So I have really advise everyone that comes into my office to take a really hard look at what this technology is trying to accomplish. What's the perceived need? Who's going to pay for it? How will they pay for it? That's a very big one that no one really thinks about, because there's lots of coding and a very complicated system behind who the payer is and what they're willing to pay for it. What drives the payer's decision, what the regulatory hurdles are. Regulatory hurdles are notorious because they aren't just fixed things like in a running sense. They are moving. They get higher, they get lower, they get farther out, because the FDA doesn't have clear guidelines about what it's going to require for each individual technologies. And then, of course, as I learned, investor expectations. Put your finger up in the air and figure out which way the wind's blowing. And the only way to do that is to pitch and pitch and pitch. So you'll see a lot of doors slam in your face, but you'll learn a lot along the way. That's certainly the case that I found eventually. So if you look at this, this is a very well understood and phenomenon called the valley of death, from the inception in the very left of the technology to its commercialization and actual profit that it's bringing in. And I've circled this sort of area where we were in our development process. So there's a huge valley of death where there's a lot of risk and no revenue generation. So how do you get through that hurdle? And it's something that I'm really pushing now hard in our company in the Greenville Health System, which is the idea of a roundtable discussion. You have each group here listed that have needs, that have expertise, that have resources. Academics are great at invention. It's what we do all the time, right? But we don't necessarily have all the money to do the things that we want to do, and we don't necessarily need to know, or we don't necessarily know where the direction is we need to go in order to fulfill a market need. Physicians are great at identifying problems. They'll tell you privately what they hate dealing with, where the pain points are, where the cost loss is. But they don't have any engineering resources. None of them have the time for it, and none of them certainly don't have the resources in terms of production or engineering. And then industry, they've got the money, they know what their needs are, but they don't like the risk at all. And so long gone are the internal R&D firms within large companies. They basically outsource that to all the small little startups, and then once the startups are ready, they gobble them up. So if you get all three of these together, talking under an NDA and some assumed property rights agreements, intellectual property rights agreements, you can really shorten that time span and the risk factor of developing new technologies. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for showing up to the talk.